Hello, welcome to our class today. I'm sorry that I need to do it audio recorded, but I don't want us to lose any time. Just a reminder, today we're covering Chapter 5. In the next few classes, we'll be doing discussions. That is based upon the day that you signed up for and the topic you signed up for, so make sure you come on the appropriate day. And then we're going to have on October 7th our exam in CCIT 127A for chapters 3 through 5. Now, Chapter 5 is performance appraisal. This is about how we determine that employees, how they're doing on the job, make some kind of a rating system, hopefully a systematic and fair rating system. The formal approach or definition of this is the systematic review and evaluation of job performance and the provision of performance feedback. And this is really important for organizations because it's how an organization adjusts the organization's performance. You work kind of in a bottom-up approach. If your individuals are doing the best job that can be done by them, then it's a reasonable presumption that the organization is also doing a good job overall. There are faults with that kind of thinking, but is at least a starting point that many organizations work from. So it's used for a variety of different purposes within an organization, for personnel decisions, for deciding who gets promoted, fired, demoted, laid off. It's also used for decisions about raises. So it's really about trying to decide who's going to get the benefits and who's going to suffer the consequences of what's going on in an organization. Developmental purposes is what one would hope it's used for, but unfortunately not as much as it should be. The idea of improving a employee's performance by letting them know what their strengths and weaknesses are, and also help them to find paths for advancement by the improvement of their performance. It also documents an organization's decisions. It is important for the organization to keep track of their performance patterns over time to see if there's decreases or increases of performance and how they can be understood to intercede if there's issues where the employee may be able to be helped. It provides a detailed account of inadequate performance, which is of course important when you're talking about an organization's making a decision about terminating an employee's employment. Ineffective employee systems, therefore, can have terrible implications for an organization and the employees. It can result in lawsuits and other problems for the employer, but also for the individual employees involved. Negative repercussions, therefore, can accrue if it's not developed and implemented well. The wrong person could be promoted, transferred, or fired. While this seems like a relatively small problem, if you need to be leveraging the best people to top positions and you're not getting them identified properly, then you have a fault in the system that means your organization is systematically underperforming because it's not getting the right people into the right jobs. You can also get feelings of inequitable treatment amongst employees if they're not getting benefits that they feel are just and fair compared to employees that are known to be lower performing but are receiving higher or better rewards. And therefore, legal challenges can come about if the system is poorly implemented or is just not very good in its structure or method of being used. You can also just have unhappy employees, as once they get the feeling that a system's not working well or is treating them badly, their effort will fall off and they'll not pay attention to the feedback, and then sometimes they'll go looking for another job because they get the feeling this is not a good place to work. Now, employee appraisal, for performance appraisal, can go terribly wrong. We're going to see a little bit of an example of that in a comedic approach. The original version of The Office was actually a British television show, and this is an excerpt, and you may recognize the similar roles being played by the British actors as from the American version of the show.
doing our staff appraisals, and some people can get a little bit nervous about that because they think they're, you know, walking the long mile to put their head on block, which is wrong. They fill out a form in advance, and they don't only sort of list their strengths and weaknesses, but also mine as a boss, you know, so it's a chance for them to tell me where we're going wrong, and we can, you know, it's very much an opportunity to
separate the wheat from the chaff.
Well, no, that sounds bad. It's, you know, it's not a witch hunt. We're not trying to find out who the worst people are.
Well, we know who they are already.
Well, no.
I've written them on my form.
You shouldn't have written them on your form.
I've underlined the worst ones.
Well, you're missing the point. Yeah.
And how's working?
Under strengths, you've just put accounts.
Yeah.
That's your job, though. That's just. No, Keith. I was sort of looking for your skills within your job. So, is there anything else you could have put there? No. Okay. Under weaknesses, you've put eczema. Right, you've left this section completely blank, Keith. You haven't done the Q&A.
I thought that you filled that in.
No. This is aimed at you. Look, to what extent do you believe that you have the skills and knowledge to perform your job effectively? And then you just tick one of the boxes. Not at all. To some extent. Very much so. Don't know. What would you tick?
Don't know.
Okay. Question 2. Do you feel you have received adequate training to use your computer effectively?
What are your options?
Same as, they're always the same. Always the same. Not at all. To some extent. Very much so. Don't know.
Don't know.
Don't know again. Okay. Do you feel you are given the flexibility to decide how best to accomplish your goals? Do you want the options again?
Yeah.
Not at all. To some extent. Always the same. Very much so. Don't know. If don't know wasn't there, what would you put?
Well, the options.
Not at all. To some extent. Very much so. Don't know.
Very much so.
Do you remember what the question was?
No.
Okay. Do you... We're going to leave that there.
And how's working?
Of course, there's any number of ways of looking at that video. One of them is the obvious awkwardness of the interaction, the fact that the employee didn't follow the instructions. But it also shows that an awful lot of what goes on in an appraisal system does depend upon the employee's participation and buy-in. The flip side is this is, of course, a comedy show, and they're creating a completely bogus kind of appraisal situation. Hopefully you've never suffered anything quite so awkward as that. A grid appraisal system will be well received by the ratees, and it will do that when it has the following features. It'll be based upon documented behaviors. People want to know that they were observed actually and not some kind of just hand-waving explanation for how they were evaluated in the process. They want to know that they were focused on important performance criteria, that they were not decided on their rating based upon some triviality or side or small factor, but on the things that really matter for getting the job done and making the organization better. It will include many perspectives. It will not be based upon one person's perspective on the employee's efforts, but it will be taken into account several different ways of looking at it. And it will be forward-looking. It will focus on improvement rather than penalizing past problems. Now, IO psychology should have an obvious level of application to performance appraisal, mostly from the position that we have measurement expertise. We have a background in knowing how to make decisions about mental processes, things that are relatively hidden from view but are revealed through behavior or other factors, such that we can then come to a determination of, at least at some reasonable degree of accuracy, of what the internal processes or overall gestalt kind of evaluation of a person's capability, competence, actions, and so forth have been. So research departments want to employ IO psychologists to oversee their performance management systems, because they want to make sure that they are using the best measurement methods possible, or at least good companies do. So performance management is just a specialized way of looking at the overall performance evaluation or appraisal system. Performance management is a motivational system of individual performance improvement, where you're using the performance appraisal system as part of an overall system. What you have there is that what you're trying to get at is objective goal setting, that the employee knows where they're trying to go and how they're supposed to get there. They're getting continuous coaching and feedback, not just on an annual or semi-annual basis or something of that nature. They get performance appraisal that's integrated into it, the traditional kind of performance appraisal system. But they also, it's more developed along the lines of developmental planning. The employee gets a sense of, well, we don't want to see you just be kicked out because you're having difficulty in this area. We want to try to help you improve in this area because it'll be best for us and best for you. All of these components have to be linked to company goals. If you're improving employees but they're not linked to the corporate or organizational goals, then what's the point? In a sense, it's a waste of resources of the organization. And it tends to operate on a continuous cycle and not just annually. Now, the practicalities of this is that no organization can spend the kind of time and money that may be required for this notion of continuous implementation. With that said, the idea that you would not simply wait for any kind of particular evaluation point to make it a more regular evaluation and an intervention system is valuable. Employees are generally most satisfied, if you remember from the earlier slide, when they receive feedback that is based upon multiple observers, multiple sources. This is sometimes called 360-degree feedback, multi-source feedback. What it does is it involves multiple raters at various organization levels, and their purpose is to evaluate and provide feedback to a specific, what you might call, targeted employee. And so subordinates, peers, supervisors, clients, customers, even evaluations of self are all taken into account to form a final evaluation or rating of the employee. So in the case of faculty, we definitely get ratings from students as well as fellow faculty. We don't get as much direct evaluation from our superiors, and that kind of comes from the long-standing history of academia to not treat the higher order officers of the organization as necessarily supervisors in the traditional employment sense. In other organizations, you would definitely have feedback from the supervisors. There are three assumptions about 360-degree feedback. When multiple raters are used, participants are happier because they become more involved in the process. Not only are they usually rating themselves, but they're also rating their fellow employees, their peer employees, and they know they're being rated by their peer employees. And on the one hand, you know that there may be some individual raters who are going to have some biases or some negative attitudes. You also know that it's not just that person, that individual's evaluation that's going to be taken into account. And so those idiosyncrasies that might be involved are less onerous. They are not going to be the kind of thing that people are really worried about because they know about the other factors that are going to be involved, or at least that can be discussed with them. Multiple raters bringing in multiple perspectives tends to bring into broader and more accurate views of performance. That's the Lisa system. It appears true. One of the things not really emphasized here is also the occasional, unusual, or rare instance is more likely to be revealed in the system because more people doing more observations. The chances of a relatively rare incident or situation being observed by another given employee is more likely to be revealed simply because you're asking more eyes have seen what's going on. There's a number of ways of dividing rating formats. Some of them have advantages, some disadvantages, some have a long history, some are relatively new in their evolution. Classic graphical rating scale has been around for many years. Behavioral anchored rating scales has also been around for a long time, but it is not as widely used as it probably should be. Checklists are very commonly used, and also have been around a long time. Employee comparison procedures are a little bit more of a more recent innovation, and there's some controversies and issues that come about with those. Graphic rating scales, oldest forms, and it consists of several traits or behaviors. You examine one specific aspect of a person's position, maybe it is their customer interaction quality or something of that nature, and the raters judge how much each person's on that trait, how they fall, where they rate. Do they exceed expectations, meet expectations, fall below expectations? And these expectations are described generally as what the organization expects a person to do. Behaviorally anchored rating systems, or bars, are similar, except that the specific rating points are described with behavioral anchors. And so it's not simply this is the expected level of behavior and you're either below it, at it, or above it, with an implication of far below, close to, far above, and that kind of thing. In the bars system, you have specific descriptions of what very poor, meets the needs, is very high, or exceptional behavior looks like. And so as we see here about a person's following procedures, relatively poor performances take shortcuts around established procedures at every opportunity. Basically someone who doesn't seem to pay attention to procedures at all, moving up to isn't very knowledgeable about procedures, doesn't make much of an effort to stick with them. So there's an apparent some attempt but not much. You get all the way up to the top level on the lower right, never deviates from procedures outlined for a particular task. It takes time to do things according to the employee manual. Apparently in this organization that would be considered an ideal. Some people will consider a bar system to have the negative of constraining people a bit towards an idealized set of behaviors when there may be several different ways of getting at a desirable outcome for the organization. Be that as it may, from the perspective of making an accurate assessment of an employee's behavior, this kind of system tends to work pretty well in terms of its accuracy. Checklists are relatively common. We use them in Frostburg State for evaluation of faculty and other employees. It's a series of items that usually have a weighting attached to them that's based upon their importance for the job, or the amount of time spent, that kind of thing. And it's indicating desirable and undesirable behaviors. And you want to see if you're an employee or an employer, you want to see desirable behaviors checked and undesirable behaviors not checked. There's also what's called a forced choice checklist, and usually what you have then is pairs of items of which one or the other must be picked as the best description for an employee. It could be several listed. In the example given here, 2 items from a group of 4. What's the best descriptive adjectives for this employee? Now the drawback for a forced choice checklist is raters just don't like it. They feel like they lose control over the rating process because they have to just pick from this list of things that people have done, this list of choices of descriptions of the employee. Employee comparison procedures are a little bit of a more current kind of system. Evaluation of raters comes about with respect to how they measure up to or compare with other employees. You can do a rank ordering where you are simply saying that Joe is top and Mary is second and Cindy is third and Mark is fourth and so forth. You can do paired comparisons where you take each pair of employees and you simply say, okay, Joe or Mary, who did better? Joe. Joe and Frank, who did better? Frank. Joe and Mark, who did better? Joe. And after doing all of those paired comparisons amongst all the employees in the department where the evaluations are being done, you can then come up with an ordering of who did overall best and who did overall worst. These are very complex because the number of comparisons that have to be made goes up exponentially as you increase the number of employees. A set of a set of 3 employees has a total of 1, 2, 3 comparisons, but you add a 4th employee to that and it goes up to 6 comparisons, and add a 5th employee goes up to 10 comparisons, and so forth. It rapidly increases, and so the number of comparisons that have to be made gets very high very quickly and becomes very tiresome to do. A forced distribution, which is similar to rank ordering, except in rank ordering you can have people be tied, is where you say that only so many people may have the highest rating, and everyone else has to be rated lower than that. This became very much a fad in recent years, especially at high-tech organizations, and it is also being phased out quickly because it was found to be extremely demotivating for employees. Since only a top 2 or 3 people out of a group of 10 or 15 could be rated as worthy of being called best, you tended to have an awful lot of people say, well, I did, really, really well too, yet you're saying I'm somehow second tier, and maybe we're all pretty good except for those 3 folks over there. And there's no way to properly take that into account, that sometimes you genuinely do have groups of individuals that are all exceptional. It's rare, but it does happen. A forced distribution does not ever allow for that kind of thing to be done. So we have some advantages and disadvantages to talk about for these various formats. Now, I'm not going to go into each of these because they're in your textbook. It's exactly this table in your textbook. And simply point out that there's a couple of key things to note: that graphical rating scales have a lack of precision, even though they're very easy to use and develop. And that ease of development and ease of use tends to mean that they're often still frequently employed. Bar systems are time and money intensive to develop. They're very, very difficult to do, and we don't see a lot of evidence they're more accurate. Though I will say lack of evidence they're more accurate is not a reason to dislike them. After all, if they're at least as accurate, that's not a bad thing. Of course, if you're getting ready to spend a lot of money, you'd like to think it was more accurate. In theory, they should produce better outcomes. Checklists are also easy to develop and easy to use, but you can get halo effects from them, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. Employee comparison methods, well, they tend to be really poorly received more than anything else. And even though they declare them as precise ratings being possible, it's extremely labor intensive to make it happen. We're going to talk here about some psychological and measurement factors that affect how performance appraisal turns out. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of all this, except simply to walk through the fact that there is a step-by-step process that we use when we're thinking about a cognitive approach to how performance appraisal happens. And in each of these steps, we have opportunities to fail to get information or improperly get information or improperly retrieve information when it's needed. And so step by step we have to observe behavior, we have to encode it. That is, we have to recognize it for what it is or fail to. And if you've had a cognitive psychology class, you're quite aware of the various ways that we may fail to encode behavior. In fact, there's various ways we may not even observe that which we're staring straight at. Then we have to store that information properly, and we may store it improperly. We may fail to store it at all. We need to retrieve the information. We may fail to retrieve it when we need to retrieve it, or the retrieval may be incomplete or inaccurate. We may also retrieve information that's simply not related. And we have to integrate the information. We have to pull it into a whole with other information. We can do that in many, many ways that are in error, one of which is to preferentially weight higher, bring in to pay attention, a greater amount of attention to information that fits a preconceived view. And so all of these things can be places where an error can happen in the process, that even no matter how well we try to develop it as an objective and systematic method, may still fail. So we're going to talk about a few common rating errors. One is the halo error. We're going to talk about distributional errors of 3 types: leniency, central tendency, and severity errors. We'll talk about a few other errors here. Now, a halo error is a rater's tendency to use a global evaluation of a ratee and making specific decisions about specific dimensions of their on their evaluation. Or it can be an unwillingness to discriminate the various independent dimensions of a ratee's performance. And whatever we've decided is true about one specific dimension or aspect of their performance, we have it influence how we rate all the other aspects of their performance that are supposed to be independently evaluated. We should not have the employees' customer interaction skills affect our evaluation of their accuracy of counting the till at the end of the day. So we have a general concept. Joe is a great guy. But because you like Joe, you tend to give higher ratings on punctuality, accuracy, productivity, and professionalism. That would be a classic halo error, because it may be that he's not actually that punctual or that professional. In fact, maybe some of his lack of professionalism is why you like him so much. He's always telling the inappropriate joke at the wrong time. There is such a thing as a true halo. We often say things like halos are bad things, and generally they do result in a lack of accuracy. But there can be a true halo in saying that not all halos are actually errors. It can be that there are actual correlations amongst the various performance dimensions. That it could very well be that an employee that is good at one aspect of their job is actually pretty good at all aspects of their job. And so a evaluator should always be aware that the halo effect doesn't deny them the right or opportunity to give high evaluations or low evaluations when appropriate across all dimensions, just because they're worried about doing the halo effect. There's a leniency bias that can happen. Raters can give higher than justified ratings. It's evidenced by raters or ratees that are higher than the others who have done ratings. So you see that this is a factor that applies to a rater. A rater tends to be lenient. And of course, when we talk about something like this, we know that there are faculty or known by students to be faculty that rarely give poor grades. It could be described as those are faculty who have a leniency bias in how they evaluate students. Their ratings being higher than the midpoint of the scale, that's not necessarily in leniency error, but it is suggestive. You need to look further to see if it's consistent across lots and lots of situations and not just one. Why do people engage in the leniency effect? And the reason they do is they want to look good, they want to be liked, and they want to keep peace in the workplace. from a faculty member's perspective, we're going to be evaluated by students. If we're known to be a lenient faculty member, if students have confidence they're going to get a good grade in a class, there's a tendency for the students to give the instructor a higher grade. This relationship between students' grades and faculty evaluations is well known, and in fact is one of the arguments against having students do faculty evaluations. Central tendency. This kind of error is when raters only use the midpoint of the scale. Now, why is that raters are lazy, they don't tend to differentiate between good and performing employees, they can be very busy. Using the word lazy is kind of prejudicial because it could be the fact that the rater is a very busy person and they're kind of like, I've got to get this done, I don't have time to think hard about it. Also, sometimes raters just really don't know what the specific employees are doing, and so they give a midpoint rating because they don't have any reason to think particularly high or particularly low. And rating scale formats tend to produce a bias towards the middle. And but also there's a little bit of a true aspect to this, that a normal distribution, there is a tendency for most employees should be in the middle levels of performance, with only a few at a very high or very low level. There's another reason for central tendency errors to occur, but it's not quite the same, that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, that's called calibration effect. Calibration effect is where the central tendency error happens for early evaluations but lessens as the evaluation period goes on. Severity raters or severity is when raters use only the low end of the rating scale, or they give lower ratings to their employees than other raters. Now, why can this be the case? Raters sometimes want to maintain the impression of being tough, keeping employees from getting too cocky or thinking that they are somehow awesome employees, when maybe the rater doesn't believe that that's fair, or wants to maintain a sense of dominance over them. But it also can be coming from a belief that low ratings is a motivator for employees and also gives a baseline for improvement. Most of these are usually poor reasons for making this kind of decision. So these distribution errors, leniency, central tendency, and severity, these are all distributional errors, and they're called that because they're creating a mismatch between an actual rating that is being given to the employees and an expected rating distribution that we would think we should see with a normal process, with the normal range of employees. The ratings, the problems that tend to come from these errors, and it comes from all three of them, is a range restriction. Because if you're piling up at the bottom or the middle or the top of the distribution, then everyone still ends up looking kind of the same. And it makes it difficult to make personnel decisions because you cannot determine who has done great and who has done poorly. Remember, I was telling you that our current, soon-to-be sunsetted evaluation system for faculty suffers from an overall leniency effect. We all look awesome in our faculty evaluations, and it does make it difficult to determine if there are some truly outstanding faculty and other faculty who are simply good. Ultimately, this has an effect on employee morale, because if you have a sense that the rating system does not recognize the better performing employees and the lesser performing employees, then it seems a little bit like an injustice is going on. There's a lack of fairness and a lack of good outcomes being generated from it. There's a few other errors that can happen. There's a recency error. Raters heavily weight the most recent interactions or observations of a ratee. There's a first impression or primacy effect that can happen. It's the opposite of recency. Raters pay too much attention to a special experience with a ratee, or more generally, they form that first impression which casts a halo over how they observe everything else that is seen. So it can be a positive first impression or a negative first impression, but whatever it is, all later interactions, all later observations of the employee have this halo cast over it that changes the interpretation of what was actually going on. There's also something called a similar to me effect. Raters tend to give more favorable ratings to ratees who are like themselves. And so, depending upon how similar to me may be defined, it can be defined along gender dimensions, racial dimensions, religious dimensions, cultural background dimensions, and numerous other age dimensions. It can all these kinds of things can create greater degrees of similarity between the rater and ratees, which can have a bias. Now, I mentioned a few moments ago that that there was something called a calibration problem that we might want to know about. I don't believe this is in your textbook. This is some things that I've recently been doing some reading about. Calibration problem is talking about how early ratings are less likely to be extreme ratings. The raters have a great desire to avoid extremely high or extremely low scores for the first few people that are evaluated when they're not going to have the opportunity to go back and change the ratings. This is less of a problem if you have the opportunity to go back and change the ratings. What people are doing in the first few judgments they're making is calibrating. They want to leave some space for later very good or very poor scores that they imagine may need to be given in the pile of employee evaluations they're doing. Or in the case of a faculty member grading papers, they want to leave some space for higher or lower grades being given. And they're using the first few papers to get a sense of, well, what's the range of quality out there in this assignment. Now, some rating systems are going to be more subject to this kind of problem than others. For instance, more subject to this kind of problem are going to be comparison systems and graphic rating scale systems. Less subject to this are going to be behaviorally anchored rating scales and checklists. They tend to be less so because of the fact that you're looking at more objective individual actions to make a decision. Rater training is something that can be done, and in fact one specific kind is called rater error training. And what it does is it focuses on describing the kinds of errors that we've just been talking about and showing raters how to avoid them. This can be a good thing. It does reduce errors, but perversely, accuracy is not necessarily improved. And you may think, what in the hell did Bernhardt just say? Reduced errors, but not necessarily an improvement in accuracy. We have to remember what our definition of error is. Error is defined as a clustering of ratings that are low, middle, or high. And so rater error training tends to reduce these clustering kinds of effects. Training, therefore, spreads out the ratings. Therefore, it reduces the amount of error as error is defined in this context. But just because error has been reduced by spreading out the ratings, that doesn't mean that the ratings are, in fact, accurate evaluations of any employee's work. That is, they're more just being spread out doesn't mean that any individual point that has been person that's been rated is being given a number that is more representative than the previous number that was given to them. A better rater training method is frame of reference training. What it does is it focuses on enhancing raters' observation and categorization skills. It establishes, therefore, a common frame of reference. In a sense, it's like creating a behaviorally anchored rating system, except you're doing it rather in advance. You're giving the raters a sense of what they should be looking for all along in their employees rather than simply at the point of making the evaluation. It tends to improve accuracy, especially when combined with what's called behavioral observational training. It should reduce the calibration problem as well. It's going to tend to also reduce error, we would think. A key area for modern research on evaluation systems or employee appraisal systems is trust. This is the extent to which raters and ratees believe that fair and accurate appraisal has been or will be made of their organization. There's even scales that have been developed to try to understand the degree to which an employee has trust for the appraisal process. It's a trust and appraisal process survey, the appraisal performance appraisal discomfort scale. And these are measuring two different things. One is literally the trust, but the other one is how comfortable are you doing this thing, doing this evaluation thing. Raters who score low on trust or high on discomfort tend to provide more lenient appraisals. If they don't trust the system very well and they're uncomfortable evaluating other people, you can imagine that leniency would be a pretty common direction a person would go. Raters can be trained to be more comfortable doing a performance appraisal by giving them some sense of how this works in a broader system, that their decisions are not final decisions on the worth of the employee, and other ways of describing it. So that is what I wanted to present with for you about appraisal systems. I don't want you to worry about the legal stuff that is in this chapter. That's not where I want us to go for this particular information in this chapter. Next classes we'll be doing our discussions, and then chapters 3 through 5 exam will be in CCIT 127 on October 2nd. Thank you, and I will see you on Wednesday, assuming my back is better.